afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone here to the Palestine Center, both those who are here in the room and everyone tuning in live online. The interns here at the Palestine Center, Paul, Rebecca, and myself, Molly, are proud to present the end of our summer lecture series entitled Palestine Abroad, The Role of International Community in the Palestine Issue. Previous lectures in the series have covered the growing international BDS movement as a new way to put pressure on growing lawmakers changing policies that harm Palestinians, and the role of foreign states in the peace process between Israel and Palestine. Today's lecture is the third and final in the series and is entitled International Organizations, a New Forum for Discussion, with Phyllis Bennis and Nadal Salman presenting. Anyone watching this panel online who has questions for the speakers can tweet those questions in with @Palestine Center, and we can field them during our Q&A session. Though today is the last panel in our intern series, the Palestine Center presents events all throughout the year. On August 18th, Samar Abdul Noor will be the speaker for Understanding Israeli Apartheid, an event that will explore the topic of Israel and the apartheid analogy. We encourage everyone interested to RSV online at thejerusalemfund.org. Our event today, International Organizations, a New Forum for Discussion, will investigate the role that international organizations such as the UN and the ICC have played in the Palestinian issue. Although Israel has violated international law several times, Palestinian attempts to gain recourse through international organizations have not yet been successful, largely in part due to the fact that UN resolutions and declarations are fairly difficult to enforce. Despite this apparent inefficacy, there have been growing Palestinian political interests in gaining active membership in these organizations. Here to discuss what greater participation in international organizations could mean for the future of Palestinians are Phyllis Bennis and Nadal Salman. Phyllis Bennis directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. She is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She has been a writer, analyst, and activist on the Middle East and UN issues for many years. In 2001, she helped found and remains on the advisory committee for the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation. She writes and speaks widely across the U.S. and the world as part of the global peace movement. Her books include Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer, and Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates Today's UN. She continues to serve as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East and UN democratization issues. Nadal Salman has more than 18 years of experience in international law, human rights, and international trade and development. He received his Bachelor's of Law and Master's of Law from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and completed a doctorate in international human rights law, summa cum laude, from the Notre Dame University Law School. He worked as a legal advisor at the Negotiation Support Unit and advised UNESCO and the Palestinian Authority on legislative reforms to protect Palestinian cultural heritage. He was a policy reform team leader on the Palestinian Investment Climate Improvement Project, focusing on business-enabling environment and trade reforms at Chemonics International. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Phyllis Bennis.
Thanks, Molly, and thank you all for coming out on this rather steamy afternoon. For those of you not in Washington, don't come. Thanks to the Palestine Center always for the consistency of the center in running these kinds of projects and bringing people together for discussions of issues and topics that are too often ignored in this city. You know, the question of the role of international organizations on the question of Palestine should be an easy one in a certain way. It was the United Nations that created the State of Israel, the United Nations that divided historic Palestine, the United Nations that said there should be a, quote, Arab state. What's the big deal? Well, the problem is none of those things have happened in the way they were supposed to happen, and mostly things that should happen at the United Nations, the centrality of the United Nations in leading international diplomacy on this issue, which is perhaps more than any other long-standing international problem, a problem that is recognized as an issue for and of the United Nations, somehow is not allowed to be brought to the United Nations. So we have a myriad of examples. You know, I want to say just one thing first. When we first started talking about this event, it was before the current horror that is going on in Gaza had begun. Gaza was already in horrific shape because of the occupation which is denied. We pulled out of Gaza in 2005. We pulled out all our settlers. We pulled out the soldiers. How can you say it's occupied? Well, because we, unlike the Israelis, rely on international law. And international law is very clear that occupation is defined on the basis of control, not on the basis of how many soldiers happen to be in any given place at any given time. And from the vantage point of control, Gaza remains occupied. That meant that Gazans are sealed in to a large outdoor prison, 1.8 million people who are not allowed to leave. There's a wall. You know, we hear a lot about the West Bank wall. We don't hear as much about the wall. But Gaza is completely walled in on all the Israeli border areas. That wall is patrolled by Israeli soldiers. It's also a military wall with gun sites, electric field, etc. The airport in Gaza, of course, was bombed years ago by the Israelis, has never been allowed to be rebuilt, and the skies are patrolled not by Gazan aircraft, but by the Israeli Air Force. The seas off the coast of Gaza are patrolled not by Gazans, or Gazan fishermen even, but by the Israeli Navy. Gaza remains occupied. But the recent 4 weeks of the Israeli assault on Gaza has made the situation so incomparably different. One of the things that it means we have to talk about, in perhaps a different way than we might have a month ago, is the difference between the role of the United Nations now and the role of the United Nations during, for example, Cast-Lead, the 3-week-long war that Israel waged against Gaza in 2008-2009, when 1,400 Gazans were killed, 13 Israelis, of whom 7 were soldiers, 4 killed in so-called friendly fire. And the role of the United Nations at that time was similar but different. Similar in the sense that at that time, like now, the UN was not able to play the role that the Charter gives it. The Charter of the United Nations, the fundamental core of international law, says that the role of the United Nations is to end the scourge of war. Period. Not to end the scourge of war when the victims are anybody except Palestinians, because, you know, we don't really have to pay attention to Palestinians. It doesn't say that. It says the work of the United Nations, the goal of the United Nations, is to end the scourge of war. But to do that, the United Nations has to be allowed in. They have to be allowed to play that role. They have to have the power to impose a ceasefire when one or another warring side decides they don't need a ceasefire yet. So that's the same. What was different in 2008, 2009, there were many differences. In both cases, Gaza and the governing forces in Gaza, led by Hamas, were quite isolated. That was not the case, we should note, in 2012, during the much shorter Israeli assault of November of 2012, which was in a period, a very brief moment, when Gaza was not isolated, when the government of Gaza was joined by the foreign ministers of half a dozen Arab countries, by the prime minister of Egypt, who came to Gaza to stand with the people of Gaza under the Israeli bombs. We're not seeing that this time around. The government of Egypt is essentially collaborating with Israel in maintaining the siege of Gaza. None of the Arab governments are prepared to support the people of Gaza. So Gazans once again stand alone. Not entirely, and not certainly in the case of people, but when we talk about governments and the United Nations, Gaza and the people of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the other parts of the occupied territory, as well as the refugees, as well as the second, third, and fourth class citizens of Israel that happen to be Palestinians. Palestinians largely stand alone. Why is that? At this time when Palestine is recognized as a state, it isn't even, unlike Israel, it even has borders. You know, the 67 borders are recognized by the United Nations as the borders of Palestine. Israel is the only country in the United Nations that has never declared its borders. It says we haven't figured them out yet, meaning we're still expanding. We still want our borders to go further. So those things are the same, despite the significant differences that we now have in terms of Palestine's role at the United Nations, its credibility and its credential at the United Nations, which is very, very different. But what still has not changed, Palestine remains the longest running problem that belongs to the United Nations. And it is at the same time perhaps the greatest failure of the United Nations, the longest lasting failure of the United Nations. The UN is supposed to be responsible for Palestinians until they have achieved their inalienable rights. Not until they achieve something that somebody might call a state, because you can call anything a state. Doesn't make it viable, doesn't make it just, doesn't make it sustainable, doesn't make it any of those things. You can point to some bits of territory that are not contiguous, that are, if you kind of imagine Swiss cheese, the Israeli-controlled areas of the West Bank and East Jerusalem are the cheese. The Palestinian areas are the holes, meaning that they're the parts that are not contiguous. The Israeli territory is now contiguous. You can get from there to there. Ariel Sharon, the late former prime minister, once known and long known as the Butcher of Beirut for his involvement in the slaughter of citizens, of civilians, of Palestinians and Lebanese during the war of 1982, was very creative when it came to diplomacy. And he invented this term that I always thought was quite brilliant. He talked about transportational contiguity. It's like, what? Well, it means if you can get from there to there, you'll say it's contiguous. Even if you have to fly in a helicopter from one point to another, even if you have to go in an underground tunnel, even if you have to go up on a bridge over somebody else's land, and the land actually doesn't touch each other, but if you can get from there to there, we'll call it contiguous. Sorry, it doesn't work. That's not going to make a state. You can call it a state, give it a telephone code and a passport and postage stamps. That doesn't make a state. A state means control by the people who live there of contiguous territory, of the entire population. And crucially, it means control of the use of force. That's what every state does. They control. This country, we don't do it very well. As anybody who sees how our country is flooded with guns knows, we don't do that very well at all. But that's not for the lack of ability to do it. It's the lack of political will. But the problem for Palestine is nobody's even talking about allowing Palestinians to have control over violence in their territory. That responsibility, everybody knows. That's one of the famous lines. Everybody knows Palestine will be disarmed from outside, and it will be Israel that maintains the control of force and violence in any Palestinian state. So Palestine from the beginning was defined at the UN as a, quote, problem, the Palestine problem. Then it was changed to the question. So now it's the Palestine Question. I just finished doing some work for the UN, rewriting their sort of book on the UN and the question of Palestine. It's like, really? Is it still a question? 65 years later? Don't we have the answers already? I thought we did, but apparently we don't. Apparently it's still a big question at the UN. And it's defined as a question because none of the answers that make sense were ever allowed to be imposed. So when you look at the UN Charter, the question of why don't we just go with what it says? Well, the answer lies just down the road about a half a mile. Well, a little more than that. The State Department, the White House, the Congress, those are the forces that determine how the UN Charter is to be defined and how it is or is not allowed to be implemented. So that's the problem that we face today. The U.S. goal in the United Nations is based on its special relationship with Israel, which began in 1967. Now, the U.S. had a perfectly good, supportive relationship with Israel before 67. The U.S., of course, supported the creation of Israel, supported the partition agreement in the UN, etc. But its relationship was quite tactical. It wasn't so close. It took the 67 war for the Pentagon to look and say, wow, we could do business with these people. And business, in fact, of course, became the operative conception of the relationship. The Pentagon looked at what the mythology said was, tiny, plucky Israel defeating 6 Arab armies. Now, in fact, that didn't happen. 4 of those big Arab armies didn't even fight, but whatever. It was clear the Israelis did pretty well militarily. They defeated the other side, and at the end of 6 days, they controlled, again, all of the territory. The Palestinians had been left with 22% of historic Palestine. Now they were left with 0%. So there is now one government in control of all of the territory of historic Palestine. That includes the State of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and occupied East Jerusalem. Together, they made up the old Palestine Mandate that was turned over to the United Nations, and it was that law of the UN that divided historic Palestine. So what does it mean when you have one government that controls all of the territory, but has different sets of laws governing different populations within that one territory? That's the legal definition of apartheid. Not because the Israeli version of apartheid is just like the South African version. It isn't. It's very different for a whole host of reasons I'm not going to get into here. But what they share is that they both stand in violation of the International Covenant against the crime of apartheid, which is a UN document signed by the majority of countries in the world, not, we should note, by our own. But that's what we have to look at. So the question of how to look at the situation in Palestine isn't just how do we get back to the two-state solution? How do we get everybody back to the table? I can promise you, the next step, somebody will be back at the table, and it will fail again. Not because people don't understand each other's narratives, not because Israelis and Palestinians don't get along. It's because it's going to be based on the failed diplomatic approach of the last 23 years. Going from 23 years of failed diplomacy to 24 years is not my idea of likely success. You know, it was the great scientist who once said, the definition of being crazy is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. That's why I called this last round the Einstein round of talks. They did the same thing and expected it to be different. Why? Because this time it was Obama doing it and Kerry doing it instead of Bush doing it. Really? You think the rest of the world really cares who's in the White House that much? No, they don't. So that was a huge problem. And probably we'll have to go through that again once or twice until we finally get back to the point that says that's not how you solve the question. You answer the question the way the United Nations should have answered it years and years and years ago, on the basis of human rights, international law, and equality for all. Now, the question of the arrangements, one state, two state, red state, blue state, that's not the business of the UN. It's not the business of all of us in this room, except for those of us in this room who happen to be Israelis or Palestinians. People who live there get to choose the arrangements. The rest of us don't. I'm a Jewish girl from California. I don't get to say how many states people should have who live half a world away. I don't live there. Why is it my business? It's my business, sort of, because I pay taxes in this country. That's where everybody in this room does have a right to have something to say to our government. Our government, and one of our demands should be, let the UN be the central actor. Rather than these situations that we've seen, there are so many examples of how the U.S. relies on its goal of the special relationship to ensure that the UN is not allowed to play the major role. So what does that look like? Well, let's look at the history of the U.S. veto. Since 1970, the U.S. has cast far more vetoes than anybody else in the Security Council. But if you count them up, you'll see that 2/3 of those vetoes were in defense of apartheid policies, either in South Africa or in Israel. 2/3 of U.S. vetoes cast in defense of apartheid. You can look at the Madrid peace talks in 1991. A lot of people sort of point to that as the beginning of the current phase of diplomacy, right? Big international conference. It was held at the Crystal Palace in Madrid. It was, you know, the big issue. I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing most of you are old enough to remember that from 1991. That's not a good thing, I'm just saying. But at those talks, you know, there was all this talk about how this is the first time there's this international conference. Well, it wasn't. There was an international day that opened it up, and then it was divided into these working groups, which was a problem because the Palestinians weren't allowed to have their own systems, their own representatives. They had to go through the Jordanians. But more important than that even was that the Israelis were promised by the United States that the representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations would not be allowed to speak, that he would be, it was always assumed to be a he, and of course it was, that he would be allowed to talk to people in the halls and report back to the Secretary General, but would not be allowed to speak. That was the official position of this so-called international conference. In 1994, Madeleine Albright, her goal for that year, stated in the U.S. letter to the General Assembly that goes out every year, was to get rid of all the old resolutions on Palestine. They were irrelevant. And now that Oslo was underway, they shouldn't be in the UN, on the UN agenda, because they are being discussed by the parties. And she specifically mentioned settlements, refugees, and Jerusalem, the three most important issues that were not under discussion in Oslo, that deliberately were postponed. So she just got up and lied, and nobody said a word except, okay, we'll just do all those things to get rid of all those resolutions. International law is limited not by the law, but by political will. And that's where civil society has a role to play, to reestablish the legitimacy and the operational ability of the UN to be at the center of what it's going to take for real protection of Palestinians. You know, we hear a lot at the UN about what they call R2P, responsibility to protect. It's the new buzzword around the UN the last 6 or 7 years. And it's the idea is, oh, all this stuff that we used to talk about, humanitarian intervention, that was really just a cover for the major powers intervening whenever they chose and giving it a humanitarian gloss. And you want to say to them, yeah, you think? But obviously that's what it was. The problem is this isn't any different. So lots of people were writing a lot about how the so-called responsibility to protect isn't going to work because it, again, is only going to be used for those interests of the powerful countries. And I thought at the time, you know, maybe what we should do, instead of saying that we should get rid of R2P, get rid of it because it's not legitimate, it doesn't reflect any kind of international equality, we should actually demand that it be the principle that's used to provide protection for Palestinians. Then we'd see how popular R2P really is at the UN. Because the idea of providing real protection when the force that you're protecting people against happens to be the closest ally of the most powerful country in the world would provide a whole new challenge for the United Nations and for the rest of the world. Very quickly, just a couple of more things that I want to mention, and then we can get back to any of this in the questions. The role of the United States right now is complicit in Israeli violations. That raises all kinds of questions about the role of the United States in the international organizations, from the UN to the International Criminal Court, where, of course, it has still not been willing to sign on as a full member of the Rome Treaty to establish the court, precisely because the U.S. is determined that its soldiers and officials will never be held accountable. For that reason, they signed off on these bilateral agreements with countries, particularly the poorest countries, particularly African countries, saying if you turn over any American citizen, soldier, anybody, to the international court, you will lose all aid that you might ever get, and we will bring other unspecified pressures to bear on you, so don't even think about doing it. And then there was what was called the Invade the Hague law that was in fact passed, you know, that basically says if the U.S., if any U.S. Official is actually arrested by the International Criminal Court and imprisoned in The Hague, the U.S. will invade the Netherlands and get them out. We will support our troops. So, you know, this is the U.S. view of what international law and the United Nations means. The question of accountability is fundamental. Israel is not held accountable either from the Goldstone report around Cast Lead or the other myriad of reports that were done, and at the moment is not going to be held accountable yet until something changes, not because they're not, well, I won't say they're guilty because we haven't had a real investigation, but not because there can't be an investigation of potential war crimes, but because they are protected by the United States. That's what has to change, and that's what brings it back to Washington. This isn't an issue for the UN. This is an issue for us. Because, and this is my last point, the role of civil society, both in the U.S. and globally, is crucial for any possible way of keeping accountability at the United Nations, for keeping the legitimacy of the United Nations. We need the UN to be able to act on behalf of its charter that says its role is to end the scourge of war. It has to be empowered to do that. When the Human Rights Council votes, I think it was 38 yes, a few abstentions, and 1 vote no, that said, no, there should not be an investigation of war crimes by all sides, I should note, not only by the occupying power, but by the occupied population as well, which I agree with. Everybody responsible for war crimes should be held accountable. The U.S. said, no, we can't do that. We won't allow it. Luckily, they don't have a veto, but they do have economic and political and diplomatic pressure that they will bring to bear on any country that dares to challenge them on these kinds of issues. So that's where we come back to the role of civil society and organizations like the Palestine Center that are part of bigger organizations, the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation that now has over 400 organizations around the country, the International Coordinating Network on Palestine, which is the broad global network of organizations accredited to the United Nations who work on the issues of enforcing international law and keeping the UN as central, who work with the special rapporteurs on human rights in Palestine, who work with the Human Rights Council, who work with the General Assembly when we can get access, etc. These are the organizations that are going to make a difference in changing that understanding of what does the law say, whether it's the UN Charter or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what does the law say versus how does it get interpreted and enforced or ignored and therefore violated by our own government. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. It's great to be here. Thank you, Molly, for the kind introduction as well. I'm going to try to be brief as much as I can. Do I need to speak to the mic? Okay. It's great to be here at the Palestine Center again to talk about Palestine and international organizations. I will try to be brief, as I mentioned, in order to allow for more Q&As. The topic is really the potential future role. I'm not, Phyllis focused more on the history maybe and why the UN didn't work so far. And my topic, the focus of my presentation will be more on the potential future role that international organizations can play in ending the occupation and protecting human rights in Palestine. The focus really will be on the main international organizations and mechanisms that can likely advance a peaceful and just resolution to the conflict. Here's the summary of options that Palestine either has or can have in the future at the UN. There's UNESCO, of course, that we are all aware of. There are other UN specialized agencies that Palestine can join. There's the International Court of Justice, and there's the International Criminal Court, and there's also the recent call by Palestine to place it under UN protection or the trusteeship of the UN Charter. Now, we all know that membership in international organization does not produce peace agreements, right? Proactive involvement and advocacy in international organizations, however, should be part of a national liberation struggle aimed at effectively utilizing international law and diplomacy in order to, first of all, expose the violations and demand just and effective remedies to these violations, uphold third states' responsibility to comply with and enforce international law, and there are, of course, many challenges, in order to achieve all of these. But after all, we have to remember that law is a tool in the struggle for justice and human rights, and it cannot be the answer to all problems and challenges. Now, Article 1 of the United Nations lists the main purposes of the organization. And these make the UN as a forum where collective international action is taken to, first of all, maintain and remove threats to peace, uphold the rule of international law, protect human rights, and promote the peaceful resolution of conflicts through collective international cooperation. Now, full UN membership for Palestine in the United Nations will provide it, as any other state, with the right and opportunity to be heard and take part in this important intergovernmental organization. Now, I want to mention briefly the statehood issue. The existence of states in international law is a matter of factual determination. UN General Assembly resolutions do not create states per se, but they help to prove whether or not an entity that has, one, a permanent population, a people, two, a defined area or territory, three, a government, has also the capacity to enter into international relations with other states. And recognition of states is a political matter and should be separate from the existence of states under international law. Currently, there are about 140 states that have recognized Palestine as a state since it declared independence in 1988. I will briefly touch also on the process for becoming a full member of the United Nations. And the most important section is really Article 4.2 of the UN Charter, which says that the admission of any state to membership in the United Nations will be effected by a decision of the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. Palestine, as we all know, has officially applied for UN membership in September 2011, but its application is or has been effectively blocked by the UN Security Council's Committee on the Admission of New Members. And that's basically because of political reasons and the threat of the US to use its veto power in the Council. The legal background of this is that in 1950, the ICJ, which is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, has advised that the General Assembly can only admit new members upon the recommendation of the Security Council. And that decision wasn't really accepted by many, including Judge that dissented and said in his dissenting opinion that a single vote would thus be able to frustrate the votes of all other members of the United Nations, and that would be an absurdity. Some have proposed to amend Article 4.2. However, many others believe that there is no need really to make any amendment to the Charter, and the current Charter should be allowed and can be read actually to not provide members of the Security Council with a veto power. The ICJ opinion, however, has shaped the practice of the UN since 1950, and without its reversal or a new Security Council recommendation to admit Palestine, the Palestinian application will effectively be blocked and on hold. Now, in December of 2012, the General Assembly of the United Nations upgraded Palestine's status to a non-member state. And we all know that many states have voted in favor, only 9 voted against, which is really less than 5% of the UN members. UN General Assembly resolutions are recommendations under the Charter, but their importance goes beyond granting Palestine with almost every procedural rights and privileges except maybe the right to vote. And why is that? Because they reflect the views of the international community on normative issues. They also serve as evidence of customary international law. As my colleague Valentina Azarov has rightly observed, the real legal value of Resolution 6719, which upgraded the status of Palestine to a state at the United Nations, is in its answer to the broader looming legal question concerning its status as a state in international law. So that has been resolved because of the so many countries that voted in favor of the resolution. Now, the resolution has direct impact on Palestine's status and standing vis-a-vis third states. Palestine now may ratify any international agreement that is deposited with the UN Secretary General under the Vienna formula or the all-state formula, which is basically a practice that the UN Secretary General has been making to seek General Assembly guidance when statehood is disputed or is unclear. And now, multilateral conventions deposited with the Secretary General are open to ratification by all states, including members of specialized agencies, which Palestine is one of them because it's a member of UNESCO. Now, a note on UNESCO. In October 2011, Palestine became a full member of UNESCO. And that meant an affirmation of Palestine's status as a state. It also meant that it's able to join international organizations and ratify a list of international treaties deposited with the UN, such as the Rome Statute of the ICC. And also it enhanced the status and standing of Palestine to pressure third-party states and international actors to demand Israeli compliance with their international obligations. In addition to UNESCO Constitution, Palestine, by the way, has ratified 8 treaties. And among the most important ones, maybe, is the 1954 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict. It also ratified the 1970 Convention on the Illegal Trade of and Cultural Properties, as well as the 1972 World Cultural and Natural Heritage Protection Convention. Now, there are, as mentioned, 8 of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're listed up there. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, Palestine now has an enhanced legal standing to demand third states seize and return artifacts illegally removed from Palestine and prosecute crimes against cultural heritage. Statehood and accession to international treaties can afford protection for rights, but they also entail obligations, so we have to also be aware of that. Palestine is required to modify its national legal system and relevant institutions according with its obligations, and its need also to do that to deter domestic violations and further its standing in third countries and international institutions to contest, prevent, and take measures against unlawful Israeli conduct. Now, on treaty ratifications specifically, as we mentioned, UNESCO membership and also UN General Assembly Resolution 6719 gave Palestine the right to ratify treaties. And that has enhanced its standing vis-a-vis third states. And it's also has improved its bargaining position vis-a-vis Israel, although many might think it's minor. But I think it's important that Palestine now is negotiating a peace agreement, or might be negotiating a peace agreement as an occupied state, not as an entity or an organization. And that's, is very important in international law. Now, strengthening the UNESCO membership and also the resolution of the General Assembly has strengthened the right to join international organizations and treaties. In April of 2014, about 4 months ago, as we know, Palestine has ratified 15 international law treaties, human rights and humanitarian conventions and treaties. And many of them are very important, including the Geneva Conventions. Now, many of these treaties, as I mentioned, enhance the protection of human rights in Palestine, but they also provide it with additional mechanisms to expose and pursue remedies for human rights and international law violations. Accession to treaties would provide Palestine with standing to demand from Israel and other states to honor their obligations and uphold the rule of law. Now, it's also important to mention that theoretically, at least, there is a way for Palestine also to join the International Court of Justice. Now, UN members are parties to the ICJ statute, which formed the World Court, as we all know it. However, non-members of the United Nations can also be admitted upon the decision of the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. The UN is likely to treat the recommendation under this article, however, similar to that one under Article 4.2, meaning that the General Assembly would not be able to approve an application to join the ICJ without a UN Security Council recommendation. However, there is a way to maybe find a way out of this. An interpretation that does not recognize a veto power seems to be more in line with the object and purpose of the United Nations. That calls, as we all know, for the peaceful resolution of international disputes. And if we allow countries to join the court, then we are encouraging the resolution of conflicts through peaceful means. Now, in any event, as we all know, unfortunately, the ICJ may not hear cases if concerned states have not recognized its jurisdiction. And Israel, unfortunately, has not accepted the jurisdiction of the court as compulsory, and therefore it will be difficult to bring cases against Israel. However, it will be possible to bring cases against other states that maybe are complicit or are supporting or in violation of their international obligations if they filed that declaration accepting the jurisdiction of the court. Now, Palestine is already a member also of other intergovernmental organizations, including the League of Arab States, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that's among the organizations. And fortunately, the Security Council veto power that belongs to the 5 permanent members, of course, does not allow or does not apply to UN specialized agencies such as UNESCO, which are free to admit new members according to their rules and procedures. Therefore, there are several UN agencies, specialized agencies, that Palestine may seek membership in. And among them are, for example, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, World Trade Property Organization. I'm not going to go through them, but these are the main ones that Palestine may seek admission to. The U.S. is not member, by the way, in some of these organizations, and therefore there is no risk of cutting funding like what happened with UNESCO. That, by the way, also violated international law. And why is that? Because states may not use their domestic legal system as the U.S. did with regard to UNESCO in order to justify non-compliance with their international obligations. Now, there are also other UN bodies that require two-thirds majority. If Palestine can get two-thirds majority of the membership of these organizations, it can also seek admission into them. And among them are the Food and Agriculture Organization, also known as FAO. There is the International Labour Organization and many other organizations that I'm not going to go through them just in order to be short and allow for more questions and answers. Also, it may seek to join the Interpol if it so wishes. International Monetary Fund, by the way, is also open because they already have a precedent of admitting Kosovo, which is not a UN member, into the organization. And by the way, voting power depends on the size of the economy, of the state economy and the world economic. So it's more for powerful economic countries. Briefly on the ICC, the Rome Statute, as we all know, became effective in July 1, 2002, and Article 12.3 of the Rome Statute allows non-parties to the Rome Statute to accept the jurisdiction of the court since July 1, 2002. And in contrast, by the way, accession to the statute only prospective, so there's no retroactive application, unlike the declaration. So if the declaration is issued, the court may have jurisdiction going as far as July 1st, 2002. In January of 2009, Palestine filed a declaration accepting the court jurisdiction beginning or as far as back as July 1, 2002. The declaration gives the ICC jurisdiction over the crimes of aggression, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes as defined by the statute. And according, by the way, to the Office of the Prosecutor, more than 400 communications were received on crimes allegedly committed in Palestine. Now, in 2012, and to be precise, in April of 2012, the ICC prosecutor decided not to proceed, citing lack of authority to adopt a method to define the term state. It stated, however, that it could in the future consider allegations of crimes committed in Palestine should competent organs of the United Nations or eventually the Assembly of States resolve the legal issue, or should the Security Council refer the situation to the ICC jurisdiction. Now, the decision was criticized by many, mainly for failing to seek judicial determination by the pre-trial chamber, because it can, in fact, look at the validity of the declaration and see if it can be done or not by Palestine. The prosecutor, by the way, also cited practice of the General Assembly that I mentioned earlier, or the Secretary General, in fact, to seek General Assembly guidance when it's controversial or unclear whether an applicant is a state. But he also, in issuing a decision, failed to note that members of specialized agencies such as UNESCO are automatically permitted to join the ICC. Also, it should be noted that his decision was issued 6 months after Palestine has joined UNESCO, so there was really room for the prosecutor to accept the declaration. Now, there's actually a recent request by the Minister of Justice in Palestine, as well as the Attorney General in Gaza, to reconsider the ICC decision, or at least submit the validity of the declaration to the pre-trial chamber. Let the court decide whether the 2009 declaration was valid or not. It isn't clear, however, whether the Office of the Prosecutor would reopen an examination that it already considered invalid in the past. Now, several human rights organizations urge Palestine to resubmit the declaration again, and that way it will avoid any legal issues with the 2009 declaration. However, it is well known that it seems, according to news reports at least, that Palestine or the PLO is trying to get a consensus, among other factions before they submit a new declaration. Amnesty also released last week an important briefing calling upon the ICC to investigate and arguing that the ICC action is the only way to break the culture of impunity and also maybe end the violence in Gaza. It also called upon Israel to do the same and accede to the ICC and accept the jurisdiction of the court, and also for the United Nations Security Council to refer the situation as it did, for example, in Darfur, Sudan. Now, there was, and that's probably going to be my last topic to discuss in this presentation. It's really about the recent request by the President of Palestine, President Mahmoud Abbas, to seek UN protection from Israeli aggression, continued occupation, and violation of international law, in particular its escalation and its bombardments against the civilian population in Gaza. Now, this is in effect going back to the UN trusteeship system, which was created to replace the League of Nations mandate system in order to administer the colonies of the defeated states after World War II. That was the main purpose of the Trusteeship Council. New areas can be placed voluntarily by states responsible for their administration under the Charter. And the Trusteeship Council was also created to assist the General Assembly in carrying out its functions according to the Charter. It should also important to note that Palau, for example, was the last trust territory of the original 11 to achieve full independence in 1994. And since then, the Trusteeship Council, which is now composed of the 5 permanent Security Council members, has been left without really any responsibilities and meets only once a year. Now, what are the main objectives really of the trusteeship system under the Charter? It is to further international peace and security and to promote the political, economic, social, and educational advancement of the inhabitants towards self-government or independence as may appropriate. There are also other objectives, including protecting human rights. I'm not going to go through them, but they're very clear and listed in the Charter. What are the pros and cons, briefly, about going back to the trusteeship system, or maybe something similar to what the Palestine was like when it was under the mandate system? Now, first of all, the legal challenge would be to look on these questions. What state is responsible for the administration of Palestine now? Some might argue that the responsibility for the administration of Palestine falls with the state that has effective control over it, meaning the occupying power, that is Israel. Palestine, however, does not lose sovereignty over its land, and hence Palestine could be considered as the administering state for the purposes of Article 77 of the Charter. Now, another legal obstacle that is both procedural as well as substantive is that under the UN Charter, there is a distinction between strategic and non-strategic areas. Now, what is strategic areas? It's not defined in the UN Charter. However, if it is considered to be a strategic area, then it would fall under the mandate or responsibility of the UN Security Council. The distinction was used only once so far, and that was in the case of the former Japanese mandated islands. And the UN back then considered these islands to be strategic because they're important to the international security, as well as being an integrated physical complex vital to the security of the United States. It should be noted also that the establishment of military bases, for example, in trust territory, doesn't necessarily make it a strategic area. So that also important to note. Now, some have argued in the past, and maybe they still believe, that Palestine is still under some sort of the responsibility of the UN General Assembly, simply because it is the successor to the League of Nations with regard to Palestine as a mandate. However, this argument isn't likely to prevail because it's not very favored, I think, by many in the decision-making circles. However, the terms of the agreement, the geographical application, the duration of such an agreement are also very important. What would be the exact mission and mandate of the trusteeship? Right? What would be the extent of the functions of the entity that would administer Palestine? Would it fully administer or only assist the Palestinian government? What would be that entity composed of? The United Nations, one state, multilateral force? What would be the status of the settlers? Are they going to be evacuated? And if so, how and by whom? What would be the fate of the wall? Would Palestine be all placed under the protection or only certain areas of Palestine? Who will finance the trusteeship? Would it be for a limited duration or open-ended until independence is achieved? These are all very, very difficult questions to answer. And therefore, due to the complexity of the issues and world politics as we all know it, it is unlikely, in my views, that the UN would actually act on the application. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll take Q&As right now. Thank you.
Yes, gentleman in the white shirt. We have a microphone coming around, so.
I really appreciate this presentation. I just have a question for both of you, in particular to you, Nidal. You are a lawyer. Now, Israel, throughout the news media, claims that they bombed the Hamas houses and property. Now, there are adjacent housing to every Hamas house that got bombed. I should introduce myself first. My name is Omar Shawa, and I come from Gaza. I was born and raised in Gaza. And in 1997, I bought an apartment house. No Hamas lives in it, but the house next to it got bombed, and due to the shock waves, my house collapsed. Now, this is just one house. Now, there are districts, complete districts, that doesn't belong to Hamas at all, that they got destroyed. And infrastructure and whatnot, electrical, water. Who's going to pay for this? Is there a recourse? Could we sue Israel for that? And if the answer is yes, it looks like we are in a straitjacket, actually, due to the UN dysfunctional capabilities. But is there a way to sue Israel to get compensation for the property? Because every time we have a house that gets bombed, we have to rebuild it ourselves. So like Phyllis said, we really stand alone. Nobody's there to compensate us. Is there a recourse? And who do I contact to sue these people?
First of all, you can contact President Abbas and urge him to...
No, he did not bomb my house.
I know, and urge him to join the ICC. The ICC, the Rome Statute, would give some justice to the victims. Thank you. Well, the problem with international law is really enforcement and finding a forum or a tribunal where you can take your cases for violations of international law. And the only forum where cases can be brought are either the ICJ, but we also that it would have to get first the consent of the concerned states before a case can be brought, or the ICC for criminal prosecution of war crimes. Now, in the 2008-2009 assault in Gaza, the United Nations did in fact receive some compensation from Israel for some of the damages that were inflicted on UN property in Gaza. So technically, there is a way to pursue compensation from or for these violations, but the forum would be really problematic unless you can find a court that can take these cases and educate them. Yeah, I mean, that's at the international level. It's problematic as long as Palestine doesn't join the ICC, and then the focus of the ICC is more on criminal prosecution, less with remedies. So it's going to be a little bit problematic to take that. So
I would answer it a little bit differently. I don't think there's a legal claim to be made. There is a promise, and it's the role that Europe has played over and over again. When there have been attacks on Gaza, Europe goes in and puts in a few billion euros to rebuild some parts. Israel goes in again, bombs it again, Europe comes back. They've already said there's talk of a $23 $23 million starting fund to rebuild. The U.S. has said they would put some money in. Most of it never shows up. What does show up usually goes to rather corrupt elements of various sorts on various sides. This is a huge problem. The possibilities for individuals getting reparations or compensation, I think, is very slim. That is the reality of it. There is no justice. That's why I think that focusing on ending the occupation, which requires ending the U.S. military aid and ending the U.S. impunity, is much more important. Unfortunately, it leaves people devastated.
You can make the claim, but there is no forum.
You can make plenty of claims.
You can make the claim, but the forum is problematic because normally the protection of nationals is through consular or diplomatic protection. It's state to state, and as long as you don't have a forum, even through arbitration, that can take these cases and decide on them, it will be very difficult to see results. So at the bottom line, I agree with Phyllis, but I think the claim should still be made.
Oh, we have a microphone coming.
Oh, thank you. The first wall that was put up by the Israelis that separated Palestine land, but now you say Gaza is completely encircled by a wall. Where did the other walls come from?
The wall that surrounds Gaza is also the Israeli wall. There's not a wall on the Egyptian border, except in certain parts. But all of the border between Gaza and Israel is surrounded by a wall. It's not talked about as much as the West Bank wall, which I should just say also is not dividing Palestine from Israel. It's not along the so-called Green Line. It's 85% of it is inside the West Bank, meaning it is taking, I think it's a total of about 15% of the West Bank is just swallowed up in that wall, making sure that, among other things, all the major water aquifers are on the Israeli side.
Solomon over here.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I have a request for Mr. Sliman. The material you presented is very excellent. For me, as an activist on this issue, it will be extremely useful to have a way to get to it. I mean, you went rather fast, and I'm not a pressy writer, so I didn't write everything down. It's just impossible. So if we could, that would be wonderful.
Happy to share the presentation. I think the center has it. So
The center has it?
yeah.
Yes.
Free?
I'm not going to charge. So
Now, I comment before my question for both of the wonderful speakers. I think that it must be known now that the Palestinian people are not that alone in the world. There's a tremendous support coming from the South American countries, the socialist tendency countries, like, of course, forever Cuba, and then Venezuela and Bolivia expelled the ambassador of Israel in 2009. And now President Morales from Bolivia said that Israel is to be considered a terrorist state. One thing. Another thing, other countries in South America, like even Chile, has cut off commercial relations. Argentina, Brazil. Brazil issued a very strong statement, and Israel answered saying they are a diplomatic midget. Brazil. 300 million people. Well, anyway. Now, the question is the following. How can a government, like, for instance, concretely the Bolivian government, how can it act in the United Nations to do something for the Palestinian people? Thank you.
Yeah, you raise a very important point. I misspoke when I spoke of the isolation of Palestine, certainly also at the level of civil society, but there are governments that are shifting as well, and Latin America is the centerpiece of it. I think there's a number of things that can be done. In the General Assembly, for instance, it was a number of Latin American countries during CAST-led, led by Ecuador, that played the key role of pushing for a much stronger position of the General Assembly. Unfortunately, the Palestinian diplomatic team did not agree with that at that time, so it didn't go forward. But that convening, for example, the Group of 77 within the General Assembly is something that the Latin America group could easily play a role in. That could mean things like moving for enforcement of the new calls that have just emerged from Amnesty International and other parts of the human rights community globally, calling for an arms embargo against Israel. There was a very important statement, which I didn't think I had time to read, but I'll just tell you very quickly, from 2006 during the General Assembly when President Lula, then president of Brazil, said in the middle of a very unrelated speech, he suddenly said, Middle Eastern issues have always been dealt with exclusively by the great powers. They have achieved no solution so far. One might ask then, is it not time to call a broad UN-sponsored conference with the participation of countries of the region and others that could contribute through their capacity and successful experience in living peacefully with differences? When we asked the Brazilians, are you serious about this? Are you prepared to lead this? They said yes at that time. They haven't taken that role further, but they could. I think it would be more difficult for a smaller country like Bolivia to play that role alone, but perhaps Bolivia, in coordination with other Latin American countries, could move for things like a meeting of the contracting parties of the Geneva Conventions. They are all signatories to the Geneva Conventions.
A request was submitted, by the way. At least by Palestine, because it's
by
now
Palestine,
party
but it
to
hasn't
Geneva.
been supported yet that I know
Not
of
yet,
from
yeah.
other countries, so they could support
Right.
the Palestinian initiative.
I agree. Yeah, yeah. There are many things that can be done, definitely.
We have one question from Twitter, and then we'll take one more from the audience. Are there any international rights laws that specifically provide protection for children?
Yeah, there's the Convention on the Protection of the Child that Palestine also has ratified recently.
Also, in the Geneva Conventions, there's a very
Absolutely.
specific, I used to know this, and I'm afraid I'm forgetting which article it is, but it speaks specifically to the need to protect children, especially in any occupied situation. Children must be given special access to education, to food, to medical care, exactly the opposite of what
What's
Israel has
happening
done
now.
in Gaza.
Okay, our last question, the gentleman in the white has raised his hand the entire time.
Our President Woodrow Wilson recognized through the King Crane Commission that Palestinians will not be dispossessed of their land without violence as a result of the, nationalization of the Judaic religion. Is kind of bizarre. Isn't it now an opportunity to go back to that time, to that legal, political reality, because and then to go on to the one-state solution, which will not force any. Miko Pellet, the son of General Matti Pellet, proposes that a resolution which allows Jews and Palestinians and Christians and seculars to live together in a vibrant secular democracy. That's all.
I wish that the King Crane Commission was a legal binding document. Unfortunately, it isn't. The problem, we have enough problems with the legal binding documents that are being
Enforcement,
routinely not enforced and violated directly. But I think your broader point is right, that the focus should not be, and particularly again for people in this country, people in the United States, it's not our call. One state, we must have two states. You know, the call should be for our government to end its policy that is grounded in support for occupation and apartheid, and instead move to a policy that is grounded in international law, human rights, and equality for all, whether that's in one state, two states, 5 states, or 10 states. We do that to challenge U.S. policies that exist today. That means stop the protection of Israel at the United Nations, tell your members of Congress they were wrong to sign on to the Support Israel, Israel Can Do No Wrong resolution that they signed on to, 2 of them in the House, 1 in the Senate, and demand an end to the U.S. military aid to Israel. That's at the tune of $3.1 billion a year to start with, and then they've added almost $1 billion more. Imagine what we could do with that money back home, with our crumbling infrastructure, with the need for health care, education. That's where that money should stay, and to rebuild Gaza. We don't need that money to be going directly to the Israeli military. That's the mobilization that needs to happen. The BDS movement is crucial at this time, the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions that is so crucial in bringing nonviolent political and economic pressure to bear on Israel and Israelis. So they begin to recognize that, yes, there is a price to be paid when you live in a government, when you live under a government that is viewed by the world as a rogue state, there is a price to be paid. In South Africa, it was when their beloved Springboks suddenly could not play in the World Cup. Israelis, it's not so much about sports. It's about science and culture. And when these cultural workers, artists, are not going to Israel because of the boycott, we'll begin to see results.
Thank you both so much for coming. Anyone who wants to stay around and ask a question that they didn't get a chance to is welcome. Thank you all for coming.
Please take a look at my books.